I'm very pleased to be joined in what we call the Downtown Den by Tom Harris, who I've known for quite some years now, columnist on the Daily Telegraph, so we'll pick his brains about that. Non-executive director for HS2, which is a significant role, and also a public affairs expert and author, but formerly a member of Parliament, former Transport Minister as well, and a journalist by trade, I think it's fair to say. Tom, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for the invite.
Great to have you. Let's start by talking about transport, Tom. Well, let me ask first of all, what impact do you think the pandemic is going to have on transport, the development of transport in the UK?
That's a good question. I mean, can I preface everything by saying that I'm not officially representing HS2, so if I say something that you find disagreeable or offensive, which I won't, but nevertheless, I'm not speaking on behalf of HS2. Yeah. I remember having a similar Zoom call with Christian Walmar, who's a very well-known transport correspondent. And it was a situation just like this, and Christian was the main speaker, and he was suggesting, this was quite near the beginning of the first lockdown, he was suggesting that the lockdown would mean a catastrophic, not catastrophic, but a very, very significant fall in the use of the car, because people would take to public transport and to bicycles post-pandemic. Now, I fundamentally disagree. I think the opposite is the case, actually. In terms of public transport, I think the challenge for public transport is that an awful lot of people want to be secure and isolated as they move. And if anything, the pandemic has actually given an extra impetus to the private car, because if you take the private car, you're isolated from everyone. You don't have to wear a mask. You don't have to worry about where you put your hands. And you don't have to worry about strangers coming up too close to you. So I actually think that it was slightly complacent I mean, of course, we all want to see public transport improve. We want to see that modal shift. I think if anything, in the short term, the pandemic is going to make a modal shift the opposite more likely. In the longer term, and we always talk in the longer term when it comes to especially infrastructure, I genuinely don't, and I may be naive, I genuinely don't see a significant fall or even a significant reduction in the increase in the number of passengers who are going to be using railways in future. I think, this is just anecdotally, but my impression is that people throughout the country are desperate to go back to business as usual. Now, what as usual means still to be defined. But I think certainly in a year or two, we'll still be suffering the aftermaths of the pandemic. I think in 5 to 10 years, I would not be at all surprised if we are back in the situation where we are complaining once again about the lack of capacity on our railways and the lack of regulation in our bus services, for example. And I don't mean that the pandemic is just a blip. I don't want to understate its importance. But the way society moves and the way we develop means that people have an instinctive, but also a business imperative to move and to meet people. And that, I don't think, in the long term is going to change. I accept it will in the short term.
Interesting, very interesting, actually, particularly about in relation to usage of cars and things. I hadn't thought about that myself too much. What about the pandemic in terms of the budget and spend by central government? 3rd of March, there's going to be a budget. Is there going to be a big cut to infrastructure projects, do you think?
Well, I'm guessing not. I mean, other people on the call may have different views, and no one knows for sure. But what's interesting about Boris Johnson is, now I know there's a lot of antipathy towards him. I'll be cards on the table. It's not an antipathy I share, even though I was a member of the Labour Party for a long time. I think he is genuinely interested in big infrastructure projects. I think he understands, perhaps more than David Cameron and George Osborne did, that if you have a massive structural deficit, the wrong way to deal with that is to simply cut services and cut budgets. Now, there's still an instinct, of course, in the Treasury to rein back spending. Spending will be reined back because we'll come out of this pandemic. Furlough will end eventually. All of these extra bits of help that have been given to people, unnecessarily given to people, will at some point end. So those kind of big ticket items will come to an end at some point soon, we hope. But in terms of the arguments for investing in infrastructure, I don't think have changed at all because of the pandemic. If anything, we have to grow our way out of this recession and grow our way out of this emergency. And you do not do that by return to business as usual and saying, well, let's cut road building, let's cut railway building. Obviously, I've got a vested interest in HS2, but we are now. We've got the notice to proceed on HS2. We are an Act of Parliament. It is illegal for us not to build HS2 now. So I don't think that is going to be affected. But of course, the onus is on all infrastructure builders. If you're being funded by public money, the onus is on to make sure you do it as efficiently as possible, make savings wherever you can. But I think we're in a new era of big projects now, which is very exciting to train buffs. But I think it's good news for the country.
Let's continue along that route, HS2, because you've touched upon it, Tom. Just give us an update as to where we are. You've said that the legislation's gone through, but I'm right in thinking that's not for the whole project, that's for a part of it, or just update us on where that's at? Phase
1 has been given royal assent and notice to proceed. That's between London, Euston and Birmingham. Then we move on to phase 2, phase 2A and phase 2B. And phase 2A takes us up to Manchester, and the eastern leg takes us over to the northeast of England. And those are still to go through parliamentary procedures and still to get royal assent. There's going to be a hybrid bill, you'll know yourself. But the procedures on hybrid bills, I was the Crossrail Minister, who was lucky enough to take the Crossrail bill through its final stages of Parliament. And that was, I only took over at the tail end of that process, but that was following a mammoth parliamentary process of getting a hybrid bill through Parliament. Hybrid bills are different from public bills because they involve private and public interests, which is why they're called hybrids. And you need them for this kind of large infrastructure project. So we're on course to complete the whole of HS2 at some point in the dim and distant future, but there's a lot of parliamentary and budget hurdles to get over before then.
And do you think, in terms of anecdotal, as you mentioned earlier, I always get a sense that it's sort of over-engineered. I go through Euston on a very regular basis, and I get a sense that money isn't, a lot of money's being spent on it.
Yes, a huge amount of money is being spent on it, absolutely. We're building a brand new Euston station. I took a tour of it during lockdown, and I'm very familiar with Euston because I used to travel there every week, went up and down to London. I wasn't even aware about just the extent of the work that's going on right next door to Euston to build the new HS2 station. It's astonishingly large. And if you're building infrastructure anywhere in London, it's expensive. Of course it is. And it's a fact that if you build something of similar size in the north of the country, it's nowhere near that cost just because of property prices in London. Yes, HS2 is expensive, and I'm only too well aware. When I was interviewed for the job, I told them that I was very conscious that politically, everything's politics, but I was very conscious that when you are spending money on a project like HS2, which frankly, doesn't have universal support across the electorate. It does across the political parties, but not across the electorate. Of course, I was a skeptic myself, but back in 2010, 2011, I was not at all convinced about HS2. I've only become more convinced of it over the years because I'm friends with people in the industry and I learn more about it. And I think it is the only genuine way we can increase capacity, but it does come with a price tag. And those are decisions. Well, once again, I'd have to pay tribute to the government because they could have taken the easy way out of this. And they could have said, no, it's going to cost too much money, let's scrap it. They could have done that at any time up until last year without losing too much, of previous, sunk costs. But they didn't. They went with it. And I think that was quite courageous. Now, they did it partly because all the opposition parties support it also, apart from the Greens, ironically. We can come on to that if you want. But it's a big ticket item. Success has many fathers, failures and orphans. So I think this is going to be a success. I think by the time this is finished, you're going to have national politicians falling over themselves to take credit for it.
Yeah, I'm a supporter as well. And just before I'm going to bring Suki in actually in a moment. He's come up with a couple of questions, so we might as well take questions as we go. I think that's a good way of doing it. He works for Atkins, I think I'm right in saying, Suki, just so you're aware of that. But before I bring him in, just on HS2, what are the chances of it reaching its final destination in the northeast? What chances would you give it?
Oh, I mean, that is the plan. I thought that was a good.
Yeah, Suki, you might want to take it until I ask you to come in. Sorry, go on, Tom.
It's entirely up to the government. I mean, at the end of the day, we do what the government instructs us to do. I don't mean to pass the buck, because as far as I'm concerned, as far as the board is concerned, the plan is to build the whole of HS2. That is still the plan today. If this or a future government change their minds, that's entirely a matter for the government.
Fair enough. Yeah, good. Suki, please do. Come in on HS2.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself too early. Just a couple of things on big infrastructure projects, Tom. How do we square the net zero commitment and decarbonisation with big infrastructure projects like HS2? I have to declare that Atkins is involved in HS2. But there's always that challenge, isn't there? The embedded carbon that will be, the carbon that will be created through not only the build phase, the operational phase. Any thoughts or reflections on that to get the HS2 program through?
Yeah.
And I've just got a second question, just about your capacity challenge and around the future of working. A lot of the capacity challenge used to be around rush hours in the morning and the evening, and actually the rest of the day the railway was fairly underused. Let's be frank. Do you see a view that actually, whilst the overall demand might stay the same, it'll be smoother? So actually, there may, what we've got at the moment is probably adequate in terms of infrastructure. Just some reflections, please.
Let me take the excellent question. Let me take the second one first, because I think that is really quite interesting. I think if you want to look at an upside of the pandemic and lockdown, I think one of the things we can look at is how easy it has been to change people's work patterns. Now, for years, we've been basically carrying fresh air around the network at off-peak times, as you know, and it has not been a good use of resources or money. And I think one of the consequences of lockdown will be that employers will start to look at much more flexible working. And that gives the industry an opportunity to look again at the structure of its timetables and when we have peak trains and when we provide more services. For example, it's been a nonsense during lockdown that train companies have been mandated, in fact, to run almost as many services, until recently, almost as many services. Most trains literally empty apart from staff. Because of some service commitments that they've signed up for. That is just nonsense. But going, into the future, we do need to address that. We do need to stop carrying fresh air around the country at off-peak times. And I just think, ministers and MPs are kind of prisoners of public expectations in that respect. If you were to have announced before the lockdown that we were radically changing the timetables and cutting off peak services and increasing peak services, even though it's not technically possible to increase peak services with the infrastructure we've got, but that aside, there would have been an outcry from people who don't use services. Usually a lot of the campaigners are not people who actually use the services affected. But I think we do now have an opportunity to kind of reinvent the railway service, and I hope the government takes that up. I think Simon later on is going to ask me about the rail review that I was involved in, which is going to be published quite soon. And that's maybe an opportunity for us to talk about that again. Carbon net zero is vital. We've had lots of meetings in HS2, We've come to, I think I'm not alone, the board has come to the conclusion quite eagerly that this whole talk about carbon net zero is box ticking. What we need is not just carbon zero in the construction. We want a plus, a beneficial carbon transaction, if you like, so that by the time we've finished working, the environment will actually have been massively improved, or at least measurably improved. We talk about replanting trees that we've had to remove for building a railway. It's not enough to do that. You've got to actually leave behind an environment that is actually improved from when you first started, from before diggers started moving onto the site. We're committed to doing that, and some of the initiatives that we're looking at are genuinely exciting. I get very frustrated. Well, I get frustrated by protesters anyway, but I do get frustrated at this idea. The Green Party is the only party in the Commons that opposes HS2. It is madness to imagine that the carbon footprint of a scheme should only be measured in its construction phase, totally ignoring the benefit of having a massive step change in capacity on a carbon neutral transport system for decades into the future. When the West Coast Main Line was upgraded in the first part of the century, the impact was so massive that scheduled flights between Liverpool and London were cancelled altogether. They no longer exist because the rail service is so improved. That's going to happen with HS2. We're going to see people shifting from planes to carbon neutral form of transport. And I don't make any apologies for that. I think it's a great thing.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks for the questions as well, Suki. Very, very good. Let's just touch upon that. You were part of a railway review, which we're still waiting for the outcome from. Can you say a bit about that, Tom?
Sure. Keith Williams, former, I think he was a deputy chairman of British Airways, and he's now the chairman of Royal Mail, led the review. I was a member of the expert challenge panel. There were 6 of us who were offering advice to Keith as he went through the review. The remit we were given was basically, we were explicitly told not to touch HS2, which is quite interesting. But it was about the franchise system. And, Keith has gone on the record about some of the changes that need to be made. And if you speak to anyone in the railway industry among the franchises, they will pretty much agree on some of the changes that need to be made. I mean, here's the irony. I love mentioning this because I like kind of counterintuitive political facts or assertions. When the railways were privatised in 94, 95, it was not done well. You won't get many people who will defend the peculiar and complicated structure that we were bequeathed by the John Major government. And incidentally, Margaret Thatcher always resisted privatising the railways because she didn't think it could be done. And it was John Major who wanted his own flagship nationalisation for political reasons, and he got it on the railways. Now, when we inherited it in 97, it was a mess. I mean, it really was a mess. And you could argue that there's so many different organisations with different statutory roles that it's still pretty untidy. But what Labour did was we actually made it a success. This isn't a party political broadcast because I'm no longer a member of the Labour Party, but we took what we inherited, and thanks in part to a growth of the economy, we put passenger numbers up to the highest in Britain's history outside wartime. And more important, or maybe not more importantly, but significantly, we actually came to something, we achieved something that Sir George Young, the Transport Secretary, when it was privatised, never for once considered. We got the profit-making franchises to give money back to the DfT. We were actually making a profit on the railways, which was not the plan. The plan in privatisation was to wind the industry down, to kind of allow it to disappear quietly into the night, and to manage that process. And the opposite happened. And I think still it's not it's not an achievement of the last Labour government that is particularly well known or heralded, but I do think it's important. Nevertheless, there came a point where the franchise system wasn't working, and it's not working. There are too few participants now, and too few people competing for the franchises. The cost of the franchises to bid for a franchise have become absurd. I mean, it's like £10 million just to take part in a franchise competition. I mean, that's just nonsense. So what we are proposing, and Keith has said this publicly, so it's not exactly a cat out of the bag, is moving to a system more like the concessions that operate with London Overground, where basically the government, or whichever the franchising authority is, pay a management contract and pay a franchisee to deliver services, and there's usually a profit sharing mechanism there as well, so that some of the profits go to the franchisee and some of the profits go to the government. Importantly, the revenue risk, unlike franchises where the train operators take the revenue risk, in a concession or a management contract, it's the government that take the revenue risk. So ultimately, it is a fairly significant shift back towards the public sector. But most people in the industry accept that. It's not to say that franchising was a failure. I think it wasn't a failure. I think in some respects it was a massive success, but it's had its day and we need something new now. And the other major thing that Keith is talking about is Labour in 2000 introduced the Strategic Rail Authority because it was needed. We needed a central guiding mind to run the services. Then 4 years later, it abolished it for reasons too dull and too bizarre to go into. But instead, we put all of those responsibilities with the Department for Transport, with civil servants, which was, I think, just an absurd change. We should never have got rid of the Strategic Rail Authority. Whether we call it that or not, Keith is proposing a new central guiding mind to allow civil servants to get on with the job that they're supposed to be doing. Civil servants were never intended to run the railways. We need rail professionals to run the railways. We need to do it at a safe distance from political interference. And that is the other main aspect of the white paper, which is shortly to be published.
Thanks, Don. I'm going to bring Jane Moore in a moment. She's got a Merseyside relevant question, which I think is well worth asking. But before I do, you were just touching upon that, and Suki's put a comment in there about the Department for Transport. Does that need much reform or radical change in terms of addressing the railways? You were sort of going down that route anyway, but does it need much change? Is it cumbersome? Is it an efficient department?
I wouldn't want to say. I mean, I work for them, technically. I don't think the DFT itself needs radical reform. I think the only radical reform that I'm concerned about at the moment is removing its railway functions, giving that to an arm's length body that can get on with the job. The idea that civil servants decide whether or not the 7:15 p.m. train from Glasgow to the Lake District, leaves on time, or how often it should, civil servants should not be writing timetables, and they have been doing that. I mean, that was not the intention, but inevitably, the longer the DFT held on to those powers, it used to be franchise documents used to be quite thin documents back in the 1990s. Now a franchise document is a massive doorstop, and you have civil servants writing the detail of bids in terms of the number of trains that pass a particular station at a particular time of day. Utter nonsense. Civil servants shouldn't be involved in that. So that's the one big review I would recommend, and will be recommending, is that civil servants are, have that power, that responsibility, which incidentally they don't want. They've never wanted it. Have that taken away from them and given to people who know what they're doing.
Thank you. Jane, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi.
Thank you.
So obviously we've seen Steve Rotheram announce the piece of work that he's doing in terms of a new railway station for Liverpool. But I'd really be interested to see what you think he should be doing and the City Region Combined Authority should be doing to assure that extension into Liverpool, so we can, as a city region, can benefit from from the extension agency?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, I'm going to speak in quite general terms. I don't know an awful lot of the specifics of Steve's proposals, but one of the quite strong message that will be coming out of the review is the need, not just for devolution, because devolution is one of those things that all politicians talk about. Whenever they can't answer a question, they say, oh, devolution, and they don't really know what they're actually meaning. What we have said about devolution is it's not enough to give local mayors and local authorities and city regions railway powers, although we do want to give them that. We need to give them the funding as well. We need to give them, there's no point, you know, if Steve, by all means, you can build, you know, you can plan as many railways and stations as you like, but if you don't have the money, then, you know, that's a pointless exercise. So we need to have, I mean, the Treasurer are very resistant to that kind of change. They've always been quite resistant to devolution in whatever it has happened because of the, you know, the financial implications. But I think, you know, I just feel there is a new sense of determination to make this kind of thing work now. So we'll have to, I'm afraid we'll just have to wait and see, but without the actual money to follow the planning powers, there's very little point in giving local mayors and city regions those powers. But I suspect there is now a renewed kind of determination to make that work.
Tom, before we move on from transport, final question from me. You were Transport Minister. What did you particularly enjoy about that role, or what moment did you particularly like about being Transport Minister? And what did you particularly not like about the role?
The only thing I didn't like was being sacked by Gordon Brown.
Right, yeah.
Before that, it was brilliant. I loved it because, you know, as a politician, I genuinely don't think there's any point to a grown-up being in politics if you don't want to be a minister, because that's when you can change things. That's when you can affect people's lives. Otherwise, it's just opposition day debates and signing LED motions, which is a monumental waste of time. But when you're a minister, you can actually do things. And even though I was a junior minister, but I still was able to make some big decisions and change people's local services. I'm always asked, what's the one big, you know, what's your most proud achievement as a minister? And I always answer the same thing, and it's true. I saved the Blackpool tram. I was late in the office one night, and I was given this very nervous civil servant come in and gave me a document for me to take home and approve overnight in my red box. And I looked at it in the office, and it said, you know, recommend that we refuse funding for the upgrading of the Blackpool and Fleetwood tram. And I looked at the bottom of it, it said consequences, the tram will have to be scrapped because it doesn't meet EU safety regulations. The minister has asked for his approval. Normally an approval is literally a tick. That's all you do. You tick it and you might put your initials on it. And I kind of put my head in my hands and I said to my private secretary, could you call that official back, please? And they came in and I said, well, you know, I've just had a quick look at your paper. First of all, no. Second of all, we need to have a meeting tomorrow. So that started up this long process of me, and the officials were great because they didn't, you know, officials get a bad press. They didn't want to cancel the tram. They felt that they had to because of financial pressures, but they wanted an alternative. And I asked them to come up with an alternative. I told them to sit down and speak to Treasury to come up with different models, find, I don't think we actually found any extra money, but we found a different way of calculating it, which is usually how Whitehall fix things. And eventually they came back, they kept coming back and giving me updates saying, oh, we're making progress, Minister. I was like, right, okay. And eventually they came back and said, we think we found a way of doing it. So they talked me through it. And it was approved by the Secretary of State and by Number 10. And the best day ever was when I was invited to Blackpool to make the announcement that we were going to give them the money. And it was just, it's what you're in politics for. Because there were all these local politicians who, you know, good people who are in the local council, the local mayor, and they had been campaigning in this for years and years. And they'd heard rumours that the government were going to cancel it, and to kind of put on the white hat and ride over the hill at the last minute and blow my trumpet saying, no, we're going to save it. It was just fantastic.
Yeah.
That was a very proud time. And that's what a government, I mean, that's what I thought a Labour government should be doing. And I said to them at the time, said, look, I don't know how people in Blackpool feel about the Blackpool tram, although I could have guessed. But I knew as a Glasgow MP that come the September weekend, more of my constituents would go to Blackpool than anywhere else. And if I, as a Glasgow MP, cancelled the Blackpool tram, I'd be out of my ear.
Yeah, good stuff. It's an excellent story. I'm sorry to hear you were done over by Gordon Brown, but
that was entirely my fault, by the way. That's what happens when you plot against your Prime Minister.
Gordon's had it in for all of us at some stage, I think.
Yeah.
Let me move on to Scottish politics. It segues well into that. Has Nicola Sturgeon had a good or a bad pandemic, do you think, Tom?
Oh, she's had an excellent pandemic, first-class pandemic. As pandemics go, this has been ideal. I think it's probably in her top 5 pandemics of all time. She's been on television every night. She has proved remarkably adept at reading out bits of paper. And she has, I mean, I think her reputation as a politician is somewhat overstated, but she has got a good communications skill of sounding normal, not like a politician, ironically. And the impact that has had on the electorate, with her on the television every night, has been a massive increase in her poll and her party's poll numbers and support for independence. And if you look on the website of any Scottish newspaper, you will find the words Nicola Sturgeon a dozen times maybe on the front pages. All stories accompanied by a photograph of her, usually wearing her tartan face mask, because of course she's Scottish, so she wouldn't wear a non-tartan face mask. So yeah, she's had a good pandemic. The last couple of weeks have been more difficult for her, with one scandal or the next. But there's no sign that any of that, whether it's internecine conflict in the SNP or a badly run vaccine rollout, there's no sign that that's having any impact on the polls.
That's interesting. And this idea of another referendum, I mean, people in England, I think, puzzle at this, having had a referendum relatively recently. But are you of the view that there should be another one, or what's the measure of that? Good
God, no. I get very frustrated, especially the Labour Party, for equivocating on this. Sturgeon herself said repeatedly during the 2014 referendum, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and it was, and it should be, because constitutional referendums are cataclysmic. They're incredibly significant. You don't hold them lightly. You don't hold them every 5 years just because one party or another has something in the manifesto. Countries have the right to a stability in their territorial settlement. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the territorial geographical settlement for the United Kingdom. And David Cameron allowed one referendum, and it was significant. And I think people who are now saying, well, things have changed. Well, they haven't. I'll come back to that. But people saying, well, it's democratic to have another referendum. I think they are denigrating and devaluing what was, internationally speaking, a very well-run, principled, democratic expression of the Scottish people's will. And let's make no bones about it. The reason SNP are calling for another referendum is not because of Brexit. It's because they lost the first one. And if Brexit had not happened, 100% guarantee that they would have lapsed onto some other excuse to call for another referendum, because it's the job of the SNP leader to campaign for independence. If you choose not to campaign for independence, and the suggestion is that if Brexit hadn't happened, the SNP would not be calling for independence, that is a lie. The idea that any SNP leader who's not calling for independence would still be in their job is a nonsense. The reason she's still in her job is because she's calling for independence. That's her job. I can't blame her. That's what she was elected to do. They would have found some other excuse. Alex Salmond actually, before he left the Commons, when he was the party's foreign affairs spokesman between 2015 2017. He said that Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister would justify another referendum. He said that the House of Commons renewing Trident would justify a second referendum. He may also have said that, you know, Boris Johnson looking at Nicola Sturgeon in a funny way would justify another referendum. You know, they would always find a reason. And I think I'm really glad that Johnson has been quite robust in saying, no, you've had a referendum, and we have. We should respect it.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to bring in James Baldwin, who I haven't seen for years. So it's very nice to see you, James. It's nice to be engaged.
Good to see you too, Simon.
Thank you. But you have a question for Tom?
I do, yes. I work for Transport for Greater Manchester, and in Greater Manchester, we've benefited from the further devolution to city regions, and we're keen to see a bit more of it, particularly because we're keen to have least greater influence over local rail services, if not control. And I was just wondering whether the rise of Nicola Sturgeon, the popularity that she has, and the call to a second referendum may have an impact on the government's appetite for further devolutions to English city regions. And I think we've got a concern at the moment that the Transport for the North's budget was cut recently, and what that might mean, and whether local authorities like Greater Manchester will end up with less influence than they already have over local rail services and pan-northern transport investment.
I understand those concerns. I think it has to be recognised that the kind of nationalism and the kind of devolution that we've seen in Scotland isn't going to be replicated anywhere else. Andy Burnham is not about to declare UDI for Manchester. Let's hope, anyway. So I think from a political perspective, it's a different kettle of fish altogether. You're right in terms of the concern of the government will be, more about the finances than the politics and the constitutional aspect of it. I mean, if I were being cynical, I would say to friends in England that you should support Scottish independence, because once Scotland's independent, the Treasury's got an extra £10 billion a year that it's going to have to find, that it's going to have, that it could use to spend on the English regions instead of subsidising Scotland. But please don't do that. But no, I think the one thing that's going to come, I'd be very surprised if the final draft of the Williams review does not leave places like Manchester with quite significant new extra rail powers. Now, as far as other devolution powers outside transport is concerned, I have no idea. But in terms of rail powers, there is, and Keith has said this on a number of occasions, that it's not sustainable for services in Manchester or Liverpool to be decided in Milton Keynes, where Network Rail's headquarters is. And I think that will find expression in whatever version of the rail review is published in the next few weeks.
That's an interesting insight, that, Tom. Thank you. Just back onto Scotland, we talked about the SNP, and you're no longer in Labour, but what are their chances now? The Labour leader's recently resigned. There's a competition, is there, for a new one? What are Labour's chances? And if we're going to get onto Westminster politics in a moment, but if they're going to have any success in a future general election, they need to win seats in Scotland, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, Scottish Labour. I mean, and ask Sarwar if he becomes leader, or Monica if she becomes leader. They're in one sense, they're in a terrible position, because being the leader of a third party in Scotland is just, I can't imagine how bloody awful that would be. But the one advantage they've got is that nobody expects Scottish Labour to do anything in May. There's no, the new leader won't have to resign the day after polling because he or she has lost X number of seats or failed to make a particular advance on its current numbers. Expectations of Scottish Labour are so low at the moment that the new leader is going to be there for quite a few years, and they'll have an opportunity after May to start talking about, about trying to rebuild Labour in Scotland. I don't know if it's possible to rebuild Labour. I don't know if there's a kind of obvious niche for Labour to fill anymore in Scotland. The SNP tickle a lot of those left-wing boxes that Labour used to talk about. And in Labour are in a bit of a calamitous situation. And one of the things that's keeping me from rejoining Labour is because in the Corbyn years, they were very equivocal in the union. Corbyn himself didn't have any appreciation or affection for the union as a historical entity. But even the new leadership have been a bit, wishy-washy over the union, because they want to attract back those voters who left them to go to the SNP. So they don't want to rule out a referendum forever. But at the same time, if you're an SNP supporter, why would you go back to the Labour Party on the promise of extra devolution? And that's another problem that Labour Party have. Encouraged by Gordon Brown, Labour are now offering federalism. The reason federalism isn't very popular in Scotland is because, well, two reasons. One is nobody knows what it is, and the second is that nobody cares. It's offering something that nobody's asked for. The only debate worth having in Scotland is independence versus the status quo. And Labour isn't anywhere in that debate. And until it gets into that debate, it's not going to go anywhere. That's purely a personal view. But I think, and the question I always ask Labour people is, at what point in recent history has granting Scottish Parliament new powers resulted in a strengthened union and a strengthened Labour Party? How often has that happened? And of course, I ask the question because the answer is obvious. Every single advance in devolution has resulted in an increase in support for the SNP and a decrease in support for the Labour Party and for the union. And yet the answer now to these latest polls showing a support for independence is federalism. Well, what was it? Was it Einstein that said that repeating the same action over and over again and expecting a different outcome is a sign of insanity? I don't know if Scottish Labour's insane, but it certainly hasn't connected with the electorate, and it doesn't look like it's going to anytime soon.
That's interesting. And let's move on to Westminster politics. And just for everybody, if you've got a question, then after this conversation around Westminster, we'll take some final questions. I'm hoping to finish on the hour. I'm sorry, I should have said at the beginning, Simon, I definitely need to because I've got another Zoom call with a minister at dead on 2:00. Excellent.
Can't be late for a minister.
No, absolutely not. No, I understand that. So if you have got questions, do start posting them up and I'll bring you in. But you were talking about Labour's chances in Scotland there. What about the chances in Westminster? What do you make of Keir Starmer, Tom?
I like Keir. I'm quite impressed. I think he has been more radical in shifting the party away from the Corbyn legacy than I thought he might. During the leadership election, he was, I think, understandably for tactical reasons, but I felt he was far too obsequious to what Corbyn stood for. He needed to do that to win the votes of people who had previously voted for Corbyn. So as a complete political cynic, I respect that. And now he's moving away quite forcibly. I think there is a sense of urgency about Starmer's changes to the party, and I think those are well made. There is an urgency about this. If he doesn't make some radical changes before very long, then he's going to lose any chance of winning power in the next election. So he's got to disassociate himself from Corbyn. I think it's very important he doesn't let Corbyn back into the Parliamentary Labour Party. I think he's got to, it's absurd. My column for today's Telegraph is saying, basically, why did the Labour Party need a public relations agency to tell them that they need to be patriotic and use the union flag? Why did nobody in the office point this out months ago, years ago? This idea, I get frustrated with the Labour left because there is this view that they really don't like us very much. They don't like the country very much. They don't like our institutions or our history or our culture or our citizens, really. they want to run a country that is different from this one. And they want to change our country so it's unrecognisable. And that makes it very difficult to be patriotic. I think Starmer is genuinely a patriot. I think his instincts are right. I don't know whether when it comes to the election, whether he will have the kind of Tony Blair touch of exciting people about the change that you need to provoke in people. And I also don't know if by the next election, crucially, whether Boris Johnson will be as unpopular as John Major was at the end of 18 years of Tory government. So there's a lot of ifs, but I think, I think he's got as good a chance of winning the next election as anyone for the last 15 years has had.
Yeah, you touched upon Boris there. I think that's interesting. He's had a mixed, my view, he's had a mixed pandemic. Some stuff he's done well, some less well. Quite a varied performance from members of the cabinet. Can you see him going? Can you see Boris? I think he'll have a bit of a bounce from the vaccination rollout. I think that's going very well. But can you see him lasting to another general election? I think they'll probably go, 4 or 5 years, but will he last that long?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking the wrong person, Simon. I don't know him personally. I think I've spoken to him once, and that was across the Chamber of the Commons back in my first Parliament, because he came in as an MP the same time as I did, and we sometimes crossed swords. He wouldn't know me from Adam. So I don't know him well enough to judge whether, there's a lot of stuff talked to Johnson about, he's got a short attention span, he's just wanted to tick the box and say he's been Prime Minister before he moves on. That may be true. I'm not sure. I think his greatest strength has been people have constantly underestimated him. They underestimated when he became, remember what happened when he became Prime Minister? He became Prime Minister in the worst circumstances that any Prime Minister has taken office. Within weeks, he deliberately jettisoned any majority he possibly could have. He expelled 21 of his MPs. He was found to have broken the law by the Supreme Court in proroguing Parliament.
I think we've just lost you a little bit there, Tom. You've frozen. I don't know whether that's... can you see that, Patrick? I can only guess at what you would be saying now, Tom. But it's that we think Boris... We've always underestimated Boris, but we think he could quite easily bounce back after this pandemic and have some success. I think we're going to have to leave it there, actually, but it's been a thoroughly interesting conversation with Tom. Sorry if you didn't get to bring one of your questions in. I hope you found it helpful. And let me just say thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.